booktube, welcome back to my channel. Today we're here for my November recap. In November I read 10 books. I participated in 3 readathons with varying levels of success. But overall I'd say that November was an excellent reading month because, well, I had a baby in October and I still read 10 books in November. I consider that to be awesome. So today we're going to talk about those 10 books and why I read them and what I thought about them a little bit. I've already spoken about most of the books in my vlogs because I've been vlogging all month, and I made Friday Reads videos at the end of each of 3 weeks. So you've heard about most of the books before, so we'll go into not much detail in this video. And I must say that because this is December, we're going to be doing Vlogmas. Even though today is December 2nd and you didn't get a video from me yesterday, we're going to be making Vlogmas videos through most of the month. So even though the month has started, even though Vlogmas has started, with a bit of a fail, we're going to continue and pretend that December 1st didn't really happen. We're going to consider December 1st to be an extension of November, and you'll see why later. So today's Vlogmas day 2. And you're going to be getting 2 videos from me today, and we're going to try to resume the schedule. And you know, we'll try to keep the schedule as much as possible, but when you have a baby in the house, schedules kind of go out of the window. You're never really sure what's going to happen because this little one, I don't know if every baby is like that, but this little one, she demands my undivided attention sometimes. Like yesterday, I had a video that was almost ready to go. It was about 5 minutes from being ready to be posted, and she just wouldn't let me go long enough to focus on that video. So that's why no Vlogmas day 1 video on the actual day 1 of Vlogmas, but on day 2 you're gonna get day 1 and day 2 videos, so that's cool. So let's talk about the books that we read in November. The first book that I read in November was Gold Digger, The Remarkable Baby Doe Tabor by Rebecca Rosenberg, and I read this one because the publisher asked me to review it, and I really enjoyed it. I gave this a 4-star rating. The story is about a young woman during the gold rush period. Her family falls into dire financial straits, and she marries the son of a rich man, a gold mine owner, and moves to Colorado, expecting that the gold mine will make a lot of money and she'll get rich and she'll be able to save her family. But she finds somehow that she has to shoulder most of the responsibility for herself and for her family through her own means. And this story is happening against a backdrop of the suffragette movement. So as we see this young woman coming of age and developing her own voice, we also see the criticism from the society because of, you know, what kind of views she wants to exert. And so I really like the feminist attitude that the author presented in this one. So I gave this a 4-star rating. So that's the first book that I finished in November. The second book was also to review for the publisher. This is an ARC that I got. And this is Lake Season by Denise Hunter. This is the first installment in a series called Bluebell in Romance. And I've read something from this author before, so I jumped at the chance to review something from her. This was a charming little book. Again, another 4-star rating. This one was set in North Carolina. We're following 3 siblings, and my assumption is that over the course of the series we'll be revisiting this family and maybe getting the romance that involves the other siblings. But in this one we're following the middle sibling named Molly, and she's a bookworm, and she's infatuated with an author without knowing much about him because he writes under a pseudonym. So when this author, unbeknownst to her, checks into the inn that she and her siblings are now running, and they start working on a mystery, she falls for him without knowing who he is. And it was charming. There was a romance, there was a mystery, and there were some literary elements. I really enjoyed this one, another 4-star rating. Then I started reading a book that was not on my TBR in any way. It was just on my shelves, and I picked it up because I thought it was time to read The Road by Cormac McCarthy, and I enjoyed this one as well. Another 4-star read, I think. This one is happening in a post-apocalyptic period in the United States. We're following a man and his son as they move from the north of the United States to the south, or towards the coast really. And I call this United States, but there's no distinction about states, and nothing happens here is united. But we're following this man and his son, and there are not a lot of details about what has caused the apocalypse or where all the other people have gone. We just know that a lot of them have died, and the people who they are trying to keep themselves away from, some of them are bad people who are looking for them to kill them and perhaps eat them because there aren't a lot of supplies, and children are being taken for food. I had a really strong reaction to some of the details in this book, and I enjoyed the sparseness of the writing, because McCarthy in this one doesn't bother with a lot of punctuation or punctuation styles. He just focuses on the story, showing the relationship between this father and son, the limitations of being two people against the world, and what that would mean if one person falls out. I absolutely enjoyed reading this one. Sorry it took me so long to finally get to it, but enjoyed the fact that I did. And this is a Pulitzer Prize winner, so I was glad that I finally got another Pulitzer winner crossed off my list. Nonfiction November was happening in November, so I actually read 5 nonfiction books during the month, and 2 of them were a little bit of a crossover because they also featured in the Buzzword Readathon. But the first nonfiction read for November was Into Thin Air by John Krakauer, and this is his accounting of what happened on Mount Everest in 1996. He went up to write a magazine article, and over the course of a few weeks, the group that he joined, some of the people that he went up there with, including his guide, they lost their lives. And so this book is his attempt to tell the story of what happened, but also compare it to other accounts of people who had climbed the mountain before, and even people who attempted to climb the mountain after he and his group had their tragedy happen there. The next book that I read was for Nonfiction November as well. That was 12 Years a Slave by Solomon Northup. This one, because of the number in the title, I read this one for the Buzzword Readathon, which the buzzword this time was to read books with numbers in the title. And this is Solomon Northup's account of his time, his 12 years that he was kidnapped and enslaved in the South in the 1800s. He was born a free man. His father had been a slave, but his father had been freed and had moved to the North. And so Solomon was born and grew up in New York, but he was tricked into traveling to Washington, D.C. for a job. And while he was there, he was kidnapped and sold into slavery. And this is his memoir, written after he had finally returned to freedom, recounting a lot of his experience as a slave. Northup's recollection serves as a kind of comparison between the life of a free black person in the 1800s in the North and the life of an enslaved black person living in the South. And the fact that Northup was able to transcend those barriers back and forth made this such a valuable piece of history, made his story such an important one to read and to know about, because the fact is that even though he had been born with the privileges of a citizen in the United States, born a free man, this color of his skin meant that he lived on the edges, that he was always in danger of being kidnapped and being sold into the life that he was sold into. So this was a very important read, total 5-star for me. I'd watched the movie before, so I was glad that I also read the book and was able to make a little bit of a comparison. I don't remember everything that happened in the movie, but I didn't read it for the comparison to the movie. I read it for the fact that so finish, okay? But I didn't read it for the comparison to the movies. I just read it because I thought it was an important book for me to read at some point. Because those 2 nonfiction reads dealt with some pretty heavy subject matter, I wanted to read some light fiction next, so I got an ebook version of Normal People by Sally Rooney, and I read that next. And I could see why this book is really polarizing. I read the book not really sure what I was thinking about while I was reading it, and even at the end, the climax that I was expecting, I didn't really see it, but I'm still processing my thoughts. I don't think I like that book as much as some people seem to have enjoyed it, but I'm giving this maybe say a 3.5-star rating. Normal People is about a couple who we meet when they're in high school and follow them through several years of their relationship as they cycle in and out of varying levels of intimacy. When they're in high school, they're dealing with the peer pressure of social acceptance, and even though they're in the same high school, because of the other parts of their persona, they don't accept each other, they don't identify with being in a relationship with each other to their friends. Well, the boy has friends, the girl does not. And we're able to compare the similarities and the differences between these 2 people, their identities, their existences, their backgrounds, their social class, and to make a comparison as we view these almost two extremes, but also find similarities between these two people. I don't want to give too much about the story away, so maybe I'm speaking a little abstractly. So it's about a boy who is poor, and his mother works for this family as a cleaner, and the family's daughter is his on-again, off-again girlfriend. Is that clear enough? And even though these two characters are supposed to be coming from different sides of the track, the similarities between their backgrounds and their identities is so profound that it makes for an interesting read. But the characters were so unlikable, their choices were so repulsive, that it added some dynamic to the book that just made me not sure how I felt about the story when I was finished reading it. So I'm really not settled on whether I think this was an overall profound or overall unsatisfying read. Maybe because of my ambiguous feelings about normal people, then I went back to some nonfiction. So my next book was The Sword by Stephen Greenblatt, and this was kind of a micro history of the book industry, book history in the 1400s. In this one, we're following a man named Poggio Braccolini, who worked as a papal secretary in the 1400s before the Pope who he served under was arrested, and he needed to find a new career. So because of his background in literature and being a scribe, he then starts to hunt down famous works from previous centuries that have been preserved in the monasteries. And so this one talks a lot about the history of Europe, the history of books, why books had almost disappeared from popular culture, and the resurgence of popularity of reading, and the debt that we really owe to book hunters like Poggio during this time. Then I read The Prince by Niccolo Machiavelli. This book has other writings by him, but I only read The Prince for now. At some point I will go back and finish reading this book, but I only read The Prince at this point. In this one, Machiavelli is talking about government and the idealistic rulership, how authority is gained, how it could be maintained, how it could be lost, giving a coda almost to people who want to be in government, people who want to be rulers. What are some of the rules that they need to follow? What are some of the mistakes that have already been made that they could avoid by reading this book? Very interesting read, especially for someone who is interested in being a leader or just wanting to observe leaders. Very interesting read given the current political climate, so I was glad that I read that one. Then I read The Hero with a Thousand Faces by Joseph Campbell. This was my other book that I started reading for the Buzzword Readathon because it has 1,000 in the title. I'd also had it on my Gone with the Book TBR because this was first published in the mid-1900s. And in this one, Joseph Campbell examines different mythological and religious stories and talks about the similarities between them. He also uses dream theory from Freud and Jung to analyze the stories that pervade our popular culture and talk about the similarities between a lot of the stories that we find ourselves reading and hearing about and telling ourselves and each other, and analyzes the different components of those stories to talk about the similarities and what they mean for us and for the people who probably wrote them in the beginning. Very interesting read, but also pretty heavy material. Not necessarily one that I would recommend reading from start to finish. This is kind of the book that you dip in and out of over a long period of time, just so you can get everything out of it, because it is a lot to read in one go. So that's how I finished my nonfiction November reading, but I still had a day or so left in the month, and I really wanted to read something else from my Gone with the Book TBR. So I downloaded an ebook version of Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier, and that's the book that I carried over into December. This was my first Daphne du Maurier read, and it was absolutely fantastic. The storyline follows a young woman who was orphaned and so has been working as a companion for an older woman. When she meets an older man, a widowed gentleman, they marry and she goes to live on his estate. But going there means that she's also living in the shadow of his former wife, who had a larger-than-life personality, is so insecure about herself. She imagines the persona of Rebecca to be even grander than she has reason to. And so she finds herself living inside a fantasy that is really a nightmare. Rebecca has echoes of Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights, but some of the issues that may have pervaded in those Victorian books are a little bit resolved in Daphne du Maurier's rendition. So it was a really interesting read for me, total 5-star, and that is how I rounded out November and started December. I'm also taking The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas into my December reads. I'd hoped to have finished it in November, but that was not a realistic goal. So hopefully I'll be done by the end of December, and I'll be able to tell you more about it as I go on. So I didn't go into too much detail about any of these books. I'll link the previous videos where I've talked about them in more detail. So if you want to hear me say a little bit more about each one of these books, then you could go watch those other videos. But for now, give me a thumbs up if you like this video, subscribe if you want to see more. Let's talk in the comments. I'd love to hear if you've read any of these titles and what you thought about them, and let's talk down there. So until next time, happy reading. Bye.